In the last World War of the 20th century, a farm boy from the rugged bushland of South Africa took to the bloody skies over Europe during World War II and made history. Embraced as a hero and one of the few by the embattled island of Britain and its king, but considered a traitor by many in his own country. Born in 1910 in Wellington, South Africa, Group Captain A.G. Sailor Malan would fight 3 battles in his life. One would end in victory over Germany.
It became known as Sailors' Day. On the 11th of August, at the height of the Battle of Britain, 74 Squadron destroyed 23 enemy aircraft.
Another would end in defeat as he took on South Africa's apartheid government.
One of the reasons they might not have arrested him was that by 1959, he was still very outspoken against apartheid, but it was also clear that he was seriously ill.
The third would end in death as a result of Parkinson's disease.
And I was relieved when he died because he was so helpless and so frustrated with this disease.
Cutting short a full, promising, yet humble life. One of Sailor Malan's 10 rules for air fighting was to always turn and face the attack. For him, this was not only true in a dogfight, it was true whenever injustice or adversity confronted you in life. This 6-episode series paints a compelling picture of the remarkable life of this, in all other respects, unremarkable ordinary man. Face the Attack, The 3 Battles of Sailor Malan uses the terms and language of the times in which the events took place, which some may find offensive or difficult to hear. Listener discretion is advised. To receive weekly episodes plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com. Episode 2: Dissent and Disaster. At the time of joining the RAF, war was still a few years away, but Malan began to excel at his new adventure. His keen eyesight and emerging flying skills thrust him forward in all forms of air training, and he gradually gained a reputation, helping his various units to win gunnery and flying competitions.
He wasn't a natural pilot. Some of his instructors were skeptical whether he was ever going to become a pilot, but he had fantastic hand-eye coordination, and he was a superb shot. That's what kind of made him famous in the end as well. The way he flew was very, very aggressive. He got very close to airplanes. He flew in very tight turns. He said that's why he loved the Spitfire. You can turn until your eyes pop out, the wings won't fall off.
The Spitfires and Hurricanes had yet to make their appearance, but Malan took to the gauntlets and other training aircraft naturally. Acting Pilot Officer Malan was posted to 74 Squadron in 1936. It would be his one and only squadron to fly in combat until he became Group Captain and led many others. 74 Squadron, known as the Tiger Squadron, and whose motto was, "I fear no man," had produced some of the most famous aces of World War I, and was to produce many more. Bob Cossey has been Secretary of the 74 Squadron Association since 1992. He has written about Malan and the renowned Tiger Squadron's history and achievements in several books. He also wrote a biography of Wing Commander John Connell Freeborn, another decorated RAF pilot and World War II ace, whose name would become inextricably linked with Malan.
The squadron was formed in 1917, and training was done at a place called London Colney, just north of London, flying the SE-5A. Was the aircraft they took to war in France. They were only there in March 1918, I think, from memory, so they had a very short First World War experience. But in that time, they were so successful in the number of enemy aircraft destroyed and damaged. That's where the Tigers sobriquet nickname came from. The Tigers in town, look at the aggression they show. One of their leading lights was the famous Mick Mallock, who was one of the First World War fighter aces, and he had other characters there like Ira Jones. And it's a very multinational squadron as well. Canadians, South Africans, Australians, as well as Brits. At the end of the war, it was like so many squadrons disbanded because it was unsustainable in peacetime. But then it reformed in 1935 with the Abyssinian crisis on the horizon, and under the command of Squadron Leader Crow, It was flying demons, Hawker demons at the time.
By this time, the squadron was trading on their tiger heritage with black and yellow dicing on the fuselage sides and tigers' heads on the tail fins.
They converted to Spitfires in 38, 39. Sailor became commander of A Flight on the squadron. He came as a pilot officer, and by the time the war started in 39, he was acting flight lieutenant. So it was a fairly quick progression through the ranks. He took command of A Flight, and then the wartime years is the time that he became the fight race that he was and is so well known for.
This is the squadron that continued to honor him after the war and his death. It was here that Malan would meet some of his greatest comrades in arms. Some would live to mourn his death. Others would fail to return from the battle that was to come. Many of the younger pilots came to look up to Malan. They were young 19-year-olds and still in the complicated throes of youth. They would learn to become hardened fighting men with all the skills and focus it takes to kill at 15,000 feet.
I've found some quotes from people who knew Sailor and their opinion of him. One of those guys who crossed the fine line that can separate the expert from the genius. And that was based on pre-war, when they were training, he became recognized as an exceptional shot. He was very, very good when it came to air-to-air combat. And that, of course, stayed with him throughout. He was always the first to acknowledge the backing and support of the squadron that enabled him to achieve what he did. He was well respected and indeed loved by all who served with him. That's rather an emotive thing to say, but in my experience, from talking to the ground crew at the time who was still alive, that word was often used.
Chamberlain had come back from his meeting with Hitler in Munich in 1938, promising peace in our time. But it was not to be. A war was coming. Training was intensified and the RAF went on a recruitment drive. A year after joining 74 Squadron, Malan had become known by the nickname that all would remember him by, Sailor, an obvious reference to his days spent seafaring. He would spend the last year of peace leading A Flight. A flight is a group of 3 planes, at various contests and at the Bastille Day celebrations in France. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 3 days later, Britain declared war on Germany and World War II had begun. In South Africa, the United Party, led by Jan Smuts, took the same step, declared war on Germany on September 6 and joined on the Allied nations' side. This was one of the most controversial decisions in South African history, given the bloodied history between Britain and South Africa. Many opposed its entry into the war on the side of Britain and other Commonwealth countries. Some even believed in alignment with Germany. Regardless, Jan Smuts went on to guide South Africa through the war and become an international statesman, respected the world over.
The Second World War did much to establish Jan Smuts as the great international statesman. He served in Churchill's war cabinet. He was instrumental in drafting the charter for the United Nations. South Africa has a great status in the world thanks to Jan Smuts during these years, which also means that Jan Smuts feels that he has the popularity as a leader, as a great leader who had helped Britain to victory.
But in South Africa, Smuts' path to glory was not straightforward. He had been defeated in the elections in 1924 by the National Party of JBM Hertzog. As a result of the crisis caused by the Great Depression in South Africa, it drove Hertzog's National Party and Jan Smuts' South African Party together, first into a coalition government, and then the two parties decided to fuse into a single party called the United Party, which made it all the way up to 1939, when the Second World War breaks out.
So 1939 is the test for the United Party government that it thought would never come. When the parties of Hertzog and Smuts negotiated their coalition and then their fusion in 1933 and 1934, the one matter they could not agree on was what would happen if Britain went to war again. Because there was so much anger and animosity around the First World War
with the English population enthusiastically participating and the Afrikaners being opposed to it, because the Afrikaners did not want to fight in Britain's war so soon after being defeated in the Anglo-Boer War. So the First World War was a traumatic experience for the South African population.
In 1914, obviously, the Great War breaks out. Like the Second World War, it's very divisive within South Africa because it's only just over a decade since the end of the Anglo-Boer War, and anti-English sentiment is still running high in South Africa. So some former Boer War generals like General Beyers and De la Rey, they take up arms against the Union government because of them backing the British Empire in the Great War. And it's quickly put down, and very controversially, Jan Smuts decides to execute one of the ringleaders, who was called Joppie Fourie, which led to enormous bitterness within the Afrikaner community. But it was also telling about the rebellion is how strong the anti-British sentiment still was. But it was also a good predictor of where people stood during the Second World War, because most of the people who backed the rebellion were people who fought in the Anglo-Boer War on the Boer side and lost family members.
And now this new party cannot decide on what happens if Britain goes to war again. So it becomes the issue that always remains unaddressed until this war came. And suddenly this party that was able to work together very nicely is split down the middle between its mostly English constituents and its Afrikaner constituents. And Smuts, even though he's an Afrikaner, represents the English interests in the party, who feel that there is an obligation, a moral obligation, to stop Hitler from taking over Europe. Therefore, Smuts and his faction in the party were in favor of going to war. JBM Hertzog and his faction, who were mostly Afrikaners, again carry with them the associations of the First World War and of the Anglo-Boer War, and they don't. As far as they are concerned, it's not their problem, it's not their war, it's far away.
What one also saw during this period was that the National Party had shifted towards the right. Hertzog had become disillusioned with democracy in itself and the painful process of democracy. He had some sympathy with the rise of fascism in Europe, which seemed so much simpler and easier than the mess of democratic politics in South Africa.
So this turns into a standoff in Parliament. And as the story goes, it was split more or less down the middle as Hertzog and Smuts both rose to address Parliament. But then Hertzog, who was prone to ranting and who could be very incoherent and irrational at times, descends into one of his rants. And in the ranting begins to defend Hitler. And that was the death knell for his political career. That swung Parliament against him. I think even the South African Parliament could see that you cannot defend Hitler and what Hitler was doing in Europe. So that gave Smuts the majority in Parliament that day. He then resigns as Prime Minister of South Africa, leaving Jan Smuts as the new Prime Minister, and Smuts then promptly takes South Africa into the Second World War.
As we see in the 1930s, with fascism on the rise in Europe, it finds supporters in various other countries. Many European countries, including Britain and even the United States, have people who sympathize with it.
And the 1930s also happens to be very pivotal years for the rise of the Afrikaner nationalist movement. So the nationalist movement during those years gains momentum, and it does so through a number of organizations. A lot of cultural organizations are established, welfare organizations, economic organizations. And as nationalism gains momentum and establishes these organizations, you see that some of them become what one would call captured by these fascist characters. One of the most important of these was the Oswald Brandwag.
In 1938, Afrikaners had a symbolic festival to celebrate the Great Trek, the move of the settlers from the Cape into the interior 100 years before, which in 1838 culminated in a battle against the Zulu, the Battle of Blood River.
And it culminates in the establishment of a cultural organization that's supposed to take the spirit of the Oxwagon Trek forward, called the Oswald Brandwag. One would call it the Sentinel, the Oxwagon Sentinel. And at first it seems like a harmless cultural organization, but very quickly it acquires a new leader called Hans van Rensburg. Its symbolism and its rituals all come to represent similar fascist movements in Europe. And they are strongly opposed to the war and even begin to plan an uprising against the South African government, which really upsets the National Party of D.F. Malan, which one would call mainstream nationalists during these years. Because as nationalist as the Afrikaner Nationalist Party was, it was still a democratic party. It still believed in the constitution and in democratic principles. What then happens is you see a power struggle amongst Afrikaner organizations during the Second World War. There was a commentator later, Tommy Boydell, he was an English Labour Party leader, who said, the Afrikaners did it as a favor during those years because they were so busy fighting amongst themselves that we could get on with the war.
Later in the war, the German government, being well aware of the divisive situation in South Africa, actively stoked the discord. An example is a propaganda feature film about the Boer War, shot and directed in Germany and revealed in an RAF magazine newsreel from 1943.
Let us take a peep inside Europe today. Near Berlin, a film is being made based on the life of Kruger and the Boer War. Emil Jannings, who plays the part of Kruger, is seen being made up for the camera. Goebbels, using his old tricks again, is anxious to disrupt relations between South Africa and ourselves, and the film has been made to coincide with the general election now pending in that country. South Africa has already played a more than magnificent part in this war, and Goebbels will receive his answer when General Smuts, one of the world's greatest men, is returned with the overwhelming backing of a united and resolute nation.
Regardless, South Africans, English, Afrikaner, and of all races from across all the armed forces would distinguish themselves in multiple theatres during World War II.
Roughly 250,000 white men joined the war effort. They were all volunteers, and they had to take an oath first to serve in Africa and then serve in the European theatre. And then also, interestingly enough, keep in mind, over 100,000 white women also joined in various roles, and roughly 80,000 black South Africans volunteered, even though they weren't allowed to carry arms, which also became an issue during the war. Because many of these people were raised in a racially segregated environment, said, well, these people are on the front line with us while they're bearing arms. That also had an effect on them when they returned to South Africa, saying we fought alongside these people. Some of them very easily slipped back into their pre-war identities, because they had returned to a South Africa that was largely unchanged by the war and still a very divided place.
Malan's brother Ralph would join the South African Air Force and lose his life in North Africa, where the South African Army and its allies would beat Rommel into a hasty retreat. It's also one of the many regions the South African Air Force would distinguish itself to. Back at RAF Hornchurch, when Britain declared war on Germany, 74 Squadron was immediately placed on alert. By then, the Spitfires had arrived, and it was in this immortal flying machine that Malan would make his name. As John Freeborn, a fellow pilot, soon to be embroiled with Malan in a controversial event, recalls,
sitting in a Spitfire is like sitting in a high-powered sports car which has been built around you. The Spitfire was a lovely aircraft and built for doing a job. The reaction to sitting in it is a feeling of great superiority over other people. Particularly, I feel that I was happy and lucky that I didn't have to fly Hurricanes. The Spitfire was a delightful, lovely airplane with no wicked characteristics. It was smooth, it was honest, and it was a pleasure.
Given his age and ability, Malan was a natural leader, and many fellow pilots, particularly younger pilots, looked up to and respected his natural ability and focus. He was seen as reserved, not loud or a braggart, but someone with a strong sense of purpose and right and wrong, a trait that would guide his moral compass his entire life. Tony Nicholas connects that formation of Malan's character back to his early days as a 13-year-old cadet on the training ship General Botha.
By his own admission later years, he certainly didn't enjoy the initiations. The second-year cadets were known as Old Salts, and the first-year cadets were known as Chums, and of course the Old Salts had serious initiation activities or ceremonies on the Chums and so on, which, looking back from all the records we have and commentary from ex-cadets of the day, it was fairly brutal at times. So that stayed with him in later life. That had quite an effect on him. He never forgot it. In later years in the Royal Air Force, he never participated in any of those antics that the younger pilots got up to. I firmly believe that it formed a very firm base for the type of person that he grew up to be. Where was the ethos of the honor and duty instilled in him? Where was his remarkable character formed? It was formed here on the South African training ship General Botha.
I did manage to track down a number of the ground crew and speak to them and ask them about Sailor and about the squadron as a whole, of course. He was a man that they could admire, they could respect. They did what was asked of them because it was fair. If they cocked anything up, they were soon told that they cocked something up. He treated them in a respectful way so that they were ready to respond positively to criticism and so forth. I think they all said that Sailor would never respect anything less than 100%. That became part of the famous Tiger spirit, if you like. Air crew and ground crew. They were the Tigers. They were the best. I think there's an example of Sailor got them taking off in a formation of 12 aircraft across a grass airfield, which not many other squadrons, if any, ever achieved. But that's to measure the discipline that he'd instilled in them.
War for Malan, however, began sadly and controversially, with a little-known incident that resulted in the first friendly fire encounter of the war for the RAF. It was known as the Battle of Barking Creek. The records of what happened were sealed until just a few years ago. What we knew up till then came from some participants and many others' assumptions. John Freeborn, then a pilot officer and only 18 years old, was, at the time of our interview, the last surviving direct participant in what happened. He recalled his relationship with Malan before the incident.
I was sailor when I joined 74 Squadron from my training school at Montrose. Sailor was commanding A flight. At the time, I was appointed Squadron Adjutant Officer a short period of time with the squadron. And this gave me the opportunity to move from B flight to A flight, which was commanded by Sailor Malan. Despite the fact I'd known Sailor since the day I joined the squadron, I found him a much more amenable person to get on with. In many ways, he was quite good to me, and I started to enjoy his company. We used to play snooker and billiards together and have long chats and walks around the aerodrome. Then, of course, the war came along and things changed. But he did show kindness to me many times before the war started. When we were equipped with the Gloucester gauntlets, he would allow me to take one home for the weekend, where I used to fly to Leeds and Bradford Airport to Eden and go home and see my family. I was always grateful for this. When the war started, things were different. In this respect, we moved out of our mess. We had to sleep in office trailers. It was most unpleasant, which resulted in myself and the man getting up very early in the morning, mostly before it was light even, and walking up and down the perimeter track, talking about many things, our family life, his family life, about his wife and his children, and how unhappy he was. Nevertheless, we had quite a happy time together, and I was impressed with his South African attitude, his bravery as a youngster when he was sent to sea, the hard time he had with the taskmasters on sailing ships, which have stood him in great stead when he joined the Air Force. He was a great man to model my life on. How lucky I was to have him. He didn't have a South African accent, not noticeable. In fact, I would never have thought, if I hadn't have known he was a South African, that he didn't speak good English. As I've said before, we were great friends before the Battle of Barking Creek.
As it had been told until a few years ago, on September 6, 1939, Malan's Spitfire flight was scrambled to intercept what was believed to be an enemy formation. On that day, Freeborn was part of Malan's flight. They spotted 2 aircraft below, and Freeborn claimed Malan gave the order, "Tally-ho, number 1, attack go." He had thought that Malan had attacked and missed. Freeborn turned and went in for the attack. The 2 aircraft were hit and both downed. Unfortunately, they were both RAF Hurricanes. One pilot was killed, the other managed an emergency landing. Malan had stated that he countermanded the order, but this is how John Freeborn remembered it at the time of our interview.
It was being fed down the wall early morning, just after first light. Heavy mists across the aerodrome. When you looked up, slim blue sky, start of a lovely day. We got a call to scramble, and this call to scramble was to a flight of 74 Squadron only. No other squadron was off flight, was scrambled. Many claimed they were, but this is not true. Malan was leading red section, 3 aircraft, and we were following behind, or were to follow behind, with Paddy Byrne leading yellow section. Unfortunately, the sailor Malan got off very quickly, and we didn't because Byrne's aircraft wouldn't start. Eventually it did start, and we went chasing after Malan. After a short time, and we were doing our best to catch the other section up, we were closing very rapidly, and we saw aircraft in front of Malan, and Malan gave the order, "Number 1 attack, go." And we thought, or at least I thought, that he'd attacked, not successfully, and pulled away. We followed on, and I attacked the aircraft in front of me, which unfortunately was a Hurricane, and shot it down. Then we appeared to break up. Byrne disappeared, where to I don't know. But Sergeant Flinders, who was flying number 3 in our yellow section, came into formation with me, and we returned to Hornchurch. When we landed, we were met by the squadron leader Samson, who told us, and told me very clearly, we shot with Byrne, shot a Hurricane down, both of us.
When Freeborn landed, he was arrested and a courts-martial was instituted. What made it particularly painful for Freeborn is that Malan appeared for the prosecution in the case, as he claimed he had called off the attack after seeing the planes were RAF Hurricanes.
Unfortunately, Malan had disappeared, and I never saw him again for several days. As I was under close arrest, I had to go to my room, and they were not allowed to mix with any of the members of the station that stay under close arrest, with an officer making sure I didn't do a bunk. This was a very unhappy state of affairs, and I might add, extremely frightening for a person my age. You asked what happened to me with the sailor Malan, or my relationship with him, which was, to say the least, extremely bad. He let me down very, very badly. He denied that he gave the order to open fire. He denied everything. And of course, he was a witness for the prosecution. He was going to make sure that he was not caught for anything.
This was Freeborn's recollection 63 years after the events took place. Before the incident, he describes Malan as being an older brother figure who he admired greatly and was quite close to.
He was 12 years older than me, and we got on extremely well. He was an extremely good pilot. The thing that stood out most about him was his manner and his bearing. He was always a tidy, smart man. He looked good in uniform, and always spoke nicely to everyone. He helped, and it was his intention to have a good flight and a good Hollywood happy sort of family. And it was as such at that time, I tried to model myself on Sailor. I adopt his attitude, adopt his thoughts, and try, as a youngster of just 18 years of age, to better myself with the knowledge that Sailor Malan was quite a great guy in my book.
However, this changed irrevocably for John Freeborn after the incident, and remained so.
After the incident, I still stayed in A-Flight. I carried on after I'd been acquitted in the normal manner, but with a great deal of difficulty between myself and Malan. Not speaking. I only spoke to him when I was answering him a question. I never asked him for anything, never discussed anything with him at any time. I was so upset that the man whom I thought and looked up to could do such a dirty stroke and trick on me.
Freeborn never reconciled what happened with Malan, and this animosity lasted until his death. Bob Cossey, historian of 74 Squadron, also authored John Freeborn's biography. He found that there were contradictions in the facts and the stories about Barking Creek, but John Freeborn would never be shifted from his belief that it was Sailor's fault. In his mind, Sailor failed to call off the attack on the Hurricanes, and that's why he and Paddy Byrne engaged and shot the Hurricanes down, even though Malan claimed to have countermanded the order.
And, I talked to him quite a lot about that, but he would just not shift from that. He would not accept that it was anybody's fault other than Sailor's for not calling off the attack. And I've read some of the other side of the story, other points of view and so forth, which conflicts with what Johnny told me. But I found Johnny would never suffer fools gladly, and if he got in his mind that somebody was at fault, he could never be persuaded, even in the course of conversation and trying to tease out of him why he felt so strongly about that issue. He would not shift. He was adamant it was Sailor's fault. Johnny always used to say that I lost my youth in the war. He said I was called up when I was 18. I went through training and so on and so forth. He became a very accomplished pilot himself. He had a few narrow escapes, like all of them did. But, he was quick to tell me of the success he had. As an individual, I did rather like him because of who he was and what he was. I felt very privileged because he and I could chat.
After decades sealed under lock and key, records of the courts-martial, although not the transcripts, have recently been released. They reveal much about what happened that day. Nick Black pursued his passion for history following a career in the RAF and the police force. He stumbled across the story of Barking Creek while working at Bordsey Radar Museum in Suffolk, England.
But I kept seeing the Battle of Barking Creek mentioned in different books and, the different historians had written throughout the 20th century. And every time I read it, it was just slightly different. Little paragraph entry in somebody's book, and then somebody's written a bit more about it, but it was different to how it had been written somewhere else. And I think the police officer in me kind of went, I want to get to the bottom of this. And what I found on unpicking it was that there was no pure, this is what happened narrative. It was more like there was various versions of like a folk tale that didn't really fit together and didn't really tell the full story.
The original courts-martial of John Freeborn and Paddy Byrne was held in camera, without any members of the public being able to have access to the documentation. Nick's research at the National Archives in Kew Gardens in London found documents pertaining to the preparation of the trial. These included letters regarding who would be called as witnesses, what kind of things they were going to talk about, and the dates that had been set for trial.
And that had all been released in 2019. So a lot of that stuff hadn't been available to a lot of the historians talking about it in the 20th century. Kind of found this breadcrumb trail where some pilots had talked about the incident in their memoirs post-war. Other historians then in the 50s, 60s, 70s had picked it up and run with it and come up with their own narratives of it. So I started seeing these links where it was like, they're actually not using primary source material at all. to tell this story. They're actually just using third-hand comments that have been passed down through the years. And for me, it was like, that's what I want to try and cut through. And when I managed to get to Kew Gardens and see that there was a lot of stuff available, I was like, oh, this is gold dust. This is stuff that nobody's ever seen before.
Nick's research uncovered more details about what transpired that day and the chain of events that would lead to such a tragic conclusion.
6th of September 1939 is a foggy day. We've seen various reports from pilots in their memoirs saying that there was either fog or mist, which is quite at odds with the blue skies of the summer that they'd been having in the sort of lead up to the war. At 6:15 a.m., a searchlight battery on the island of Mersey in the Blackwater estuary reports back to 11 Group that they have heard an aircraft fly over them. Now, this makes sense because you think about searchlight batteries and AA batteries along the coastline. They were all Observer Corps or they were Royal Artillery. They were all trained to spot, differences between identification of the low-flying aircraft overhead by silhouette and shape. Now, if they couldn't see because of heavy fog along the coastline that morning, then they would have raised the alarm and said, there's an aircraft that's flown overhead that we can't identify, heading for London. We're at a point here where a few weeks earlier, actually 26th of August, Dowding had given an order out to Fighter Command saying, if we say concentrate on London, then we've got a mass invasion, mass bombing raid coming here, and we need you to throw all the assets you can in the air, protect London, get into the Thames estuary. So they did the right thing. They did the absolutely right thing, raising the alarm. What happened then was that North Weald Sector Command was the first to be notified, which was Group Captain David Lucking. And what should have happened was that he should have followed standard procedure and launched a squadron of aircraft, which would have been 6 aircraft to go and investigate this. 2 flights of 3, 6 in total.
According to Nick, Lucking had developed a reputation for being somewhat of a panicker during the exercises in the late part of August, and was famed for launching every asset he had up into the air. With the words of Dowding from a few weeks earlier in a memo saying, concentrate on London, mass invasion, the urge to protect the city at all costs just 3 days into the war prompted him to get every aircraft into the air. This contradicts John Freeborn's account that no other aircraft were launched in response to this alert. So, Lucking began to scramble aircraft.
He starts with the 151 Squadron from North Weald at 6:30 in the morning and launches their fighters to basically be sent out and go and investigate the unidentified aircraft that had been heard at Mersey. What kind of cascades out of there is a calamity of errors, really, in that those aircraft that were launched were detected on the Chainholme radar station at Canewdon in Southend, which, again, if you're looking at a map, you can see Southend is in that line between Mersey and London and the Thames estuary. Chainholme radar station there is supposed to be pointing out to sea. The radar screen itself goes 360 degrees, but there's an electronic blocker put on the backside signals so that you can't pick up planes that are flying over Britain. The radar is supposed to be detecting things coming in over the east coast. So what happens is the radar station at Canewdon pick up a large blip of aircraft coming in from the east.
What they were actually seeing was these aircraft being launched from North Weald, to the east of them. But, combined with the report from 11 Group of aircraft heard over Mersey heading towards London, it began to paint a picture of a mass attack from German forces on the capital.
From London, from all over the south coast, what you start to see is panic from controllers, from squadron commanders, from sector commanders. And when you then realize that for every aircraft that went into the air, more radar contacts were appearing on the radar scope at the broken radar scope at Canewdon, you start to realize that actually the communications back and forth must have been frantic, because if they're going, oh, the blip's getting bigger, there's more aircraft, there's even more aircraft, oh my goodness, there's even more aircraft. You can imagine what it was like, that they just were like, this is it. This is the big bombing raid that we've been waiting for. There was absolute chaos in this command and control system that Dowding had set up. The Dowding system is lauded because it was an excellent link between searchlight batteries, radar, fighter command, and then the squadrons on the ground, and then the aircraft in the air, it rightly worked, and they tested it through the summer. They'd never tested it in action, but they tested it with, other aircraft, their own aircraft. It just shows that actually on the day when things really are kicking off, people were making mistakes. Another thing you got to remember is we're looking at the 6th of September here, 3 days into the war. If you look through that period from the 3rd to the 6th of September, what you see is that on the 3rd of September, less than 2 hours after the declaration of war has been broadcast on radios across the country, there is an air raid siren goes off in London, and fighters are scrambled from London-based air bases for an aircraft coming in over the French coast. There's a great quote from that I found from a journalist in London at the time who said that she spoke to her friend who claimed that he'd heard a bomb go off nearby. Now, no bombs went off in London that morning, but people were absolutely sure that with the declaration of war on Germany on the 3rd of September, that there would be Luftwaffe bombers over London within hours.
Within an hour of the initial report, over 120 aircraft had been launched from all over 11 and 12th Group, including 56 Squadron, that ultimately came into contact with Malan and 74 Squadron. They're all searching for the unidentified aircraft. Some are even circling over the Thames estuary by the dockyards at Chatham, and they get fired on by their own anti-aircraft guns who are there to guard the estuary.
We know that from the archival records of the squadrons that there were several aircraft from some of these squadrons that were shot at, one of which was hit, but with no severe damage. Not long afterwards, what we know is then that 2 pilots of 56 Squadron, Montague, Hulton Harrop, and Frank Rose, had been delayed in their takeoff. Common narrative a lot of the time tells the story that they were impetuous, that they wanted to jump up out of bed and go and help their colleagues in the first big scramble of the war. It's not true. Frank Rose's own crash record of the incident states that he had been told to go and get in the air, despite the fact that there was all these aircraft being launched as well. He'd been told to go and launch, and he'd actually been in an aircraft himself and had started the procedure before being kicked out of his aircraft in favor of his flight commander because his flight commander couldn't get his own aircraft started. So Frank Rose then gets in an aircraft which was delayed a little bit getting off the ground, and he takes off and he catches up with Montague, Hulton Harrop in another Hurricane from 56 Squadron, who had also been delayed in getting off the ground. And they fly together and are told basically in their procedures, if you get separated from your squadron at all, then you just head north, as you were told on your original orders, head north and investigate the target over Essex. So they group together, they find each other, two Hurricanes, and they head north. They've lost the rest of 56 Squadron, 12 aircraft that are then flying ahead of them. What happens then is obviously 74 Squadron, led by Sailor Malan, with Tinky Measures and Sergeant Hawken in A flight, and Paddy Byrne leading John Freeborn and Polly Flinders in B section. They are flying north, and Sailor Malan sees 2 fighter aircraft behind a bigger formation of aircraft. And light bulb moment in his head goes, oh, we know that the Germans fly in pairs. They don't fly in threes like we do. They fly in pairs.
This was a tactic known to be used by German Messerschmitt fighters when escorting bombers, as seen during recent conflicts, including the Spanish Civil War that the Luftwaffe had been fighting in.
So he calls over the radio, tally-ho, number 1, attack, go. Those words are quoted through nearly every record of this. What we assume from what we can get from records is that Paddy Byrne, Freeborn, and Flinders, likely all 3 of them, dive down to engage these 2 aircraft. Only Byrne and Freeborn fire. We don't know why Flinders didn't fire. I can't find any records as to why Flinders didn't fire. Byrne makes contact with Frank Rose's Hurricane, and Freeborn fires on Hulton Harrop's Hurricane, killing him outright pretty much straight away. Bullet goes through the back of his cockpit and through the back of his head. Both planes crash land just outside Ipswich. Frank Rose is able to bring his to a safe crash landing, but Hulton Harrop is dead. Freeborn and Byrne join up again with the rest of their group to head home, and Freeborn tries to attack another aircraft, a 2-engined aircraft, which he thinks is an HE-111. He claimed that he was going in for the attack, and Flinders literally flew his Spitfire in front of Freeborn to stop him attacking. So there's a lot of, you can see a lot of red mist going on here, that they're all, they're really geared up for it and they're ready for it.
This confirms Freeborn's recollection of this moment.
At this stage, Malan had disappeared, Byrne had disappeared, and I was trying with Sergeant Flinders. Well, we came across a twin-engine aircraft, which I was about to attack, and Flinders got in the way. But he was waggling his wings and shouting, "Don't shoot, it's a Blenheim."
They go back, they land back at Hornchurch, and upon landing, Freeborn and Byrne are arrested for the incident, for the death of the pilot, Montague Halton Harrop.
The courts-martial itself was ultimately dismissed as a case of the fog of war. It was deemed a tragic incident and Freeborn and Byrne were acquitted. But the facts of exactly what happened that morning and why the attack wasn't called off have never fully been uncovered.
Sailor Malan gave an order to attack. That's clear. We know that. Everybody said that. John Freeborn said that he heard that. Basically, him giving an order to his number one section, his other guys, led by Byrne, go and attack what you can see in front of you.
Nick also reminds us that when comparing the silhouette of a Messerschmitt and a Hurricane from distance, with its squared-off stubby wings, it's easy to see why from a distance they might have seen two aircraft flying in a formation that they know to be a German formation and concluded they were enemy aircraft. But a major part of the story lies in what happened next.
Now, Malan is claimed to have said that he countermanded the order. This is probably actually one of the biggest investigation points that I wanted to pick up on here. But it also was one of these things that I couldn't shake out of my head. Sailor Malan, this well-respected and incredibly studious officer of the Royal Air Force, is being accused of barefaced lying in a court-martial trial against two of his own officers. How has Malan been stood in the witness box, potentially, saying, "I countermanded the order and they ignored me"? He doesn't seem like the kind of person who would stand up there and lie. And then it struck me, because I was reading Al Deer's book. He's another pilot who was involved in the incident. And he mentions that during the exercises in the back end of August, they were having terrible problems with a device called Pipsqueak. Now, Pipsqueak was a device that was hooked up to the radios that were in the Spitfires. It would basically give off a homing signal, which would be picked up by 3 ground-based radio receiver masts and triangulated to find out where the aircraft was and relay that back to their sector command.
Pipsqueak was a forerunner of IFF, Identity, Friend and Foe, as we know it now. A transponder that would be used in modern-day aircraft and a system that was developed as part of radar development at RAF Bawdsey during the 1930s. By September 1939, IFF had been tested but wasn't ready. So what some of the aircraft had was Pipsqueak. It used a clockwork timer connected to another device in the cockpit. And for 14 seconds of every minute, it cut the radio connection and switched it to a backup channel. In the Spitfire at that time, the TR-9B, there were 2 channels, one for talking to the ground, and the other is the Pipsqueak channel.
If Malan has given an order on his radio to say attack, and then during the period where he has tried to give a countermanding order to say break off because he's realized it's a mistake, if Pipsqueak has been activated while that's happening, his radio transmission is heard by nobody. Knowing what I know about Malan, and knowing what I know about Pipsqueak from having done some research on that, the fact that it wasn't heard is far more likely than Malan didn't actually do it and then lied about it later on. I see a flight commander who has tried to call his pilots off and they've gone and shot their own, killed 1 pilot, destroyed 2 aircraft, and who he's very disappointed in or furious with, rightly so, potentially. You've got to bear in mind as well, these are pilots, this is one of their first operational sorties, and certainly one, for Malan, it's the first time he's seen an enemy aircraft and he's given an order. It's very, very obvious that Pipsqueak is one of the things at the heart of this, along with the radar issues that we talked about already. Malan has clearly tried to give this order, which nobody has heard. This has got to be the reason why this incident happened. So what I think potentially is that Malan had seen aircraft and he'd ordered his pilots to go down and attack, but that he was expecting that they would carry out their own recognition procedure upon getting close enough to attack. We know that hasn't been carried out correctly, because maybe they've gone, oh, he's telling me to attack, I'm going to go and attack. That's what I'm there to do. And they've got red mist and they've gone, this is it, game's on. I'm going to get the first kill of the war, potentially. I'm not saying this has happened, but you can see that this is a likely scenario. But ultimately, the two pilots involved, Paddy Byrne and John Freeborn, are acquitted of the incident at the court-martial because it's put down to a tragic incident, fog of war. They knew about the radar fault by that point. They'd obviously done bits of investigation around procedure and various other things, and couldn't find that they had been hugely at fault. Interestingly enough, they were charged not with causing the death of another pilot, but with being responsible for the destruction of His Majesty's property.
And while this battle has gone down in aviation history, the name itself is something of a misnomer.
Barking Creek is not really a kind of place it was kind of related to, but it has tones of this kind of farce, of a kind of hushed up incident, of something that people don't want to talk about. And, you know, that's kind of the legend that it took on. It's like supposed to sound like this idyllic place, whereas actually I think it was a sewage off run for the Thames or something, which again, you know, it kind of is played into folklore as you go along. I think it's kind of one of these where the pilots came up with that name because they weren't allowed to talk about the incident. So when they said about, oh, you were at Barking Creek, weren't you? It was like the first battle of the war, but a farcical battle that they weren't allowed to talk about.
The incident will always be remembered as resulting in the first death of an RAF fighter pilot of World War II, and creating the oddity that the first combat kill of the lauded Supermarine Spitfire was actually one of their own. Yet the impacts of this tragedy were far-reaching and arguably pivotal to the outcome of the war.
I laud Hulton Harrop. He died before he had a chance to be involved in the war. He's not lauded as one of the few. But for me, he is a man whose tragic death helped the RAF win the Battle of Britain. If he hadn't died at the point that he did, we might have never realised that pipsqueak was a huge issue in pilot communication. By the end of the Battle of Britain, we had IFF in nearly all of the aircraft that we were flying, and radar operators were able to determine whether it was an RAF aircraft they were looking at or whether it was a German aircraft they were looking at. The command and control system and how they talked to each other, the telecommunications network was all in place and was working, but we know that post-Barking Creek, they really tightened up identification procedures. They didn't scramble mass launches of aircraft again. They only sent up flights of 6 as they were supposed to. You know, these kind of things were put into place to avoid these things happening. But I do think that if Hulton Harrop had not been shot down on the 6th of September, a lot of these things might not have surfaced until June of 1940, and we might have found ourselves with a big problem where we weren't ready for the Germans to come over the coast.
When interviewed more than 20 years ago, we learned that Jonathan Malan wasn't even aware of the Battle of Barking Creek.
It was never mentioned to me, probably because people are sensitive. That's not the kind of thing that you would tell the son of a famous man. If it was true, I can see my dad being very ashamed and very penitent about something that caused the death of one of his fellow pilots. If it's true, I would say that it's a shocking reflection on anybody who would give the order and then deny that it goes order. Best case scenario is that it's a misunderstanding, in which case Johnny Freeborn would have something to be ashamed of, levelling an accusation against a fellow officer. If I was in Johnny Freeborn's position, and that's a true story, I would have pursued the matter and I would have had Salem run Port Washington, but out of loyalty to my fellow officer who was killed. My guess is it was a misunderstanding. It's just one of those things that happen in the heat of battle. Stakes were made, people were shot down, and one blames the other. I can't see my father denying responsibility for something he was responsible for. I grew up with him. I always knew as a pretty forthright, honest man.
While Nick's research has helped shed more light, it is likely that the whole truth will not be known until the courts-martial transcript records are unsealed and we can finally know what was actually said in that courtroom and what evidence was presented.
I fervently believe we're going to find a sailor Malan who is very disappointed and maybe even angry at two young, maybe impetuous pilots who he's relied on to do a job and has sent into combat, and they've lost their heads and rushed in when they should have checked what they were doing. I think that's why he was called as a witness. And, you know, if he didn't want to, he could have possibly said, I've got nothing to add to this. I'm not going to appear in the prosecution box. But he's there. I really believe that he was there to make sure, if he was right, that those pilots who'd ignored his orders were not pilots anymore. And I think potentially that might be why Freeborn held such resentment to Malan for the rest of his life. Malan was all about airmanship. And 74 as well. They had an amazing reputation to uphold from the end of the First World War. You know, there's a reason why they're called the Flying Tigers. It was a reputation well deserved. And I think for me, maybe Malan felt let down. Maybe he felt that he had, you know, on the very first real test, two pilots that he trusted had let him down. He took what he did incredibly seriously. It was a vocation for him. His development of the 10 rules for airmanship, you know, that comes out of somebody who takes his job incredibly seriously and wants to make sure that all the other pilots around him are taking it as seriously. Without people like Malan, we might not have been as good as we were in the Battle of Britain.
The Battle of Britain was a few months away, but 1940 was the beginning of Sailor Malan's journey to status of hero in the eyes of the British people and others. A reference he shunned and was always deeply unsure and embarrassed of. Malan saw action over Dunkirk as the British tried to frantically evacuate men from the beaches. Day in and day out, he would fly combat missions to destroy prowling German aircraft. It was on one of these that he shot down his first enemy plane. Coming up on episode 3 of Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Sailor Malan.
The adrenaline is flowing. Many times, in the heat of battle, is a great desire to do the job you've been sent to do.
So the night that I was born, I'm told that my dad shot 2 aircraft out of the sky over London.
It's the Battle of Britain, and Malan becomes a household name. But as well as fighting the enemy, he's fighting to keep his men alive.
You have the hunter-killers on both sides who are really good at shooting others down, and the rest are targets. He's trying to stop some of his men from being pure targets.
Many months on the front line start to take their toll.
He, I think, got his traumatic syndrome from knowing that the young pilots that were replacing the old ones were going to last about a week to 2 weeks.
And his 10 rules for air fighting shape air combat for generations to come.
Go in quickly, punch hard, and then the crucial bit, get out.
Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Sailor Malan was written and produced by Protea Rose Originals. To receive weekly episodes, plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com.